I was starving. It's not unusual to feel hungry, but this hunger felt different. Not the normal gnawing in your stomach, but an insatiable need, something deep and unrelenting. My mind was clouded with thoughts of the diner I'd been to last week. It wasn't the best place to eat, but it had been a long day, and I just wanted something to eat quickly. Chicken wings. That's all I wanted. A meal to fill the void, to get me through the day. The old diner had always been a bit off, one of those places that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. Neon lights flickered above the windows, casting a sickly glow on the cracked linoleum floor. There were always too few people inside, and the staff had this weird, vacant look in their eyes. But that day, the hunger was too much, and I didn't care. I walked in and noticed immediately that the diner was quieter than usual. The air felt thick, almost sticky, like I was walking through something dense, something suffocating. The man behind the counter was staring at me, his eyes sunken and dark, as if he hadn't slept in ages. "Here for the usual?" he asked, his voice monotone and disinterested. "Yeah, chicken wings and fries," I replied, a bit taken aback by how lifeless he sounded. "And a soda, I guess." He didn't smile, just nodded and handed me my food. I sat in a corner booth, glancing around the room. The diner was almost empty, save for a few scattered patrons. They didn't look particularly friendly, nor did they seem very alive. I started eating, shoveling the chicken wings into my mouth without thinking, without even really tasting them. But as I chewed, something didn't feel right. The meat, instead of being tender and juicy, felt like it was wrong. Something strange, an uncanny texture, as if the chicken was resisting. I spat the piece out, horrified, and stared down at my plate. The chicken wings were changing. I blinked, and when I looked back, the crispy skin was crumbling away, turning into feathers. The bones shifted, warped, and the wings began to grow, pulling themselves back into the form of a whole chicken. The raw flesh twitched. I pushed back from the table, feeling a surge of panic wash over me. The fries had started doing the same thing. They began to shrink, twisting into roots, turning back into their raw, earthy form, becoming potatoes once more, wriggling and squirming as though trying to burrow into the ground. My stomach flipped, nausea rising like bile in my throat. Before I could react, I heard a voice behind me, deep and raspy. "You need to eat fast." I turned to see the man from behind the counter standing there, watching me with dead eyes. His face was impassive, emotionless, as if he had seen this all before. "What?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What's happening?" "You have 10 minutes, he said, his voice low and monotone. "If you don't finish in 10 minutes, it all comes back to life. And it's not just food anymore." I looked at him, confused, trying to process what he was saying. 10 minutes? What did that even mean? But before I could ask another question, I heard a loud, horrified gasp from the next booth. A young boy had taken a bite out of his burger, but it wasn't a burger anymore. The patty had transformed into a piece of raw cow flesh, its skin twitching, its eyes wide and frightened. The boy, his mouth frozen in terror, dropped the burger as it started to squirm and twitch, turning back into a living, breathing cow, hoofs clattering against the floor as it tried to stand. The man behind the counter didn't seem fazed. He just looked at the boy and said, "You should have eaten faster." I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. Around me, others were realizing the horror. One person had been eating their fries too slowly, and they began to transform into a mass of raw potatoes, their body twisting, merging with the food. There was no escape, no way out. I turned toward the door, desperate to leave, but it wouldn't budge. The handle wouldn't turn, and I tugged at it frantically, realizing with a sickening dread that I was trapped. Trapped inside a diner with food that was alive, trying to eat me. Trying to consume me. The man behind the counter spoke again, his words cutting through the panic in my mind. You have to eat quickly. You don't want to be slow, or you'll become part of the food. It didn't make sense. But I didn't have time to question it. I picked up the chicken wing again, but it was no longer a chicken wing. It was a part of the animal, raw, living. I couldn't eat it. I couldn't force myself to. Then I saw something worse. Other people who hadn't finished their meals were being pulled into the growing mass of living food. Their bodies, their limbs, their very forms were merging with the food, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of horror as they became part of the monstrous creatures that were foaming before my eyes. I was suffocating. Trapped. I felt a deep, gnawing dread in my chest, like the air around me was thick with something suffocating. The food wasn't just food anymore, it was a living entity, hungry, angry, and alive in a way that was unnatural. There was no escape. I turned around, looking for anyone who could help, but everyone around me was gone. In their place was only the twisted, living food, crawling and writhing across the floor, merging together to create something larger, something more monstrous. The once familiar chicken wings, fries, and burgers were now part of a living, breathing nightmare. One man who had been sitting at the counter was now a grotesque mass of food, his body torn and reshaped into something hideous. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, only the sickening sound of food being mashed together. I had to get out. I had to run. But when I reached the door again, it was sealed shut. The walls seemed to shift, moving toward me, as though the diner itself was alive, hungry, and closing in. Then, I saw it. The man behind the counter wasn't just a man. He was something else entirely, something older, something darker. His eyes gleamed with an eerie light, and his lips curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a grin, a knowing grin, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. You've eaten, he said, his voice carrying a chilling undertone. But now, it's time to become part of the feast. And as I watched, horrified, the food began to change again. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, all of it began to twist and warp. The food was no longer just food. It had become something far worse. I ran. I had to run. But I knew, deep down, there was no escape. The curse had claimed me, and I was just another piece of the endless hunger. The hunger that never ends.